Grace Xi. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Mass Communication, Advertising, and Public Relations. Her background is in strategic communication research. She received her PhD in communication from the University of Miami. And prior to Boston University, she was at Virginia Commonwealth University for 3 years, 4 years?
3 years.
For 3 years. Are you all set? Okay, let's give a nice hand for Dr. Grace.
Hey guys, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for the introduction, Michelle. Grace G, Assistant Professor in Marketing Communication Research. So I actually don't remember when was the last time I gave a research talk in person. Since the pandemic started. It was probably 2 years or 3 years ago in Orlando. Maybe I'll remember.
Oh, yeah.
That was like the last conference we ever had. And of course, I've been teaching in person, but research is something I have deeply in heart. So I'm so happy and excited to share my research with you guys today. So this is the title of my research. The topic I'm gonna go through today. So as Michelle mentioned, my background is in strategic communication. So when people ask me, what do you do for research? I say stakeholder engagement. So here the next question would be, what's stakeholder engagement? So what's stakeholder engagement, guys? Well, stakeholder engagement apparently has 2 words in this phrase, right? So in order to understand stakeholder engagement, we need to understand what's a stakeholder, and of course, what's engagement. But for today's agenda, I wanted to let you guys know that I will firstly go through my research program, where I spend a considerable amount of time and different projects looking into stakeholder engagement and how my research has evolved over the years. And then I will spend some time to guide you through 2 recent studies that I've conducted within the realm of stakeholder engagement, but taking a different perspective. And then hopefully we'll have time open for Q&A. Sounds good? Okay, go back to what's stakeholder engagement. Yeah. So what's a stakeholder? Now I feel like I'm teaching a class. Do we have any PR, advertising, marketing, business fun people here? You definitely have heard about that, right? Well, so to summarize, by definition, so stakeholder is a group of people, can be individuals or can be organizations or entities who consider themselves are related to an organization. So this connection with a given organization, can have influence on, the business, both the business and also the return on expectation objectives and the missions of an organization. And more importantly, this group of people and entities, they are fully aware of their influence on a given organization. So you maybe wonder, then how is stakeholder different from publics? How is that different from markets? And how is that different from audiences? Right? Those are all great questions. I don't know if you're asking, but I will be asking me if I heard about that, right? So what are the differences? I would say if we draw a diagram, a Venn diagram, we definitely will see, overlapping areas among or between the terminologies that I just mentioned. So, if we think about publics, well, that's the group of people we usually mention in public relations, right? So Dr. Aruna Krishna talked about publics last time when we had this talk. So the differences between publics and organization and stakeholders are publics do not always know or aware of the power or the engagement they have with an organization. So with that said, there's latent publics, there's aware publics, there's hallucinant publics, right? So not every single type of publics can be considered as stakeholders. That's one thing. And what about markets? So markets are often mentioned in marketing research or business practices, right? So when we think about markets, so markets, no matter it's organizations, companies, or individual groups, their impact on a given organization is often primarily focused on the business bottom lines. So we're talking about dollar signs now. Versus stakeholders, again, I mentioned, they do not only have impact on the business bottom lines, but also have on return on impact expectations. So, and then what about audiences? So audiences often, they do interact with organizations, but this type of interaction or message receiving process is often mediated through some sort of media. So it could be mass media, it could be emails and a personal media, but then compared to stakeholders often, they may sometimes have more direct interactions with the organizations at interpersonal levels. So hopefully that laid out some confusions about what is a stakeholder, right? But then what's engagement, right? That's the second part of this phrase. So what's engagement? So then my take on engagement, well, essentially centers on two parts. So how the organizations engage in interacting with stakeholders, and also from the stakeholders' perspective, how do they react to those communication interactions, those communication behaviors initiated by the organizations. So essentially, if you think about communication on a spectrum, it's the message senders and the message receivers, right? So, looking into my past studies, from the communication strategies that I have looked into, I can give you some examples. So, for example, for Fortune 500 companies, how they use social media to interact with their online stakeholders, and with group of collaborators across multiple institutions, we have looked at, use the elaboration likelihood model to conceptualize message strategies as the central cues, and also the interactivity functions embedded in those social media posts as the peripheral cues, and how they independently would impact on stakeholder engagement, and also if there's any interactions between those two types of cues. What have exerts, to which degree, what type of impact on stakeholder engagement. So that study was actually sponsored, funded by the Arthur Page Center, and then we used the money. We also developed a follow-up study, which we used this model. So this model was a computer, we used a computer media, some sort of like big data research, used data mining, and computational methods to look at that model, and then we bring the model down to experiments to look at the causal linkage between an organization strategies, again, from the central cues and the peripheral cues, demonstrated by the media the message strategies and functional strategies, and how would that impact on specifically in nonprofit sectors, how nonprofit stakeholders would interact communicatively by sharing the message, the information that the nonprofit organizations they're advocating for the causes, or and how they would behaviorally donate or doing fundraising for the campaigns that a nonprofit organization is interested in. And of course, from the stakeholders' perspective, I try to understand in which situations stakeholders would or would not interact with the communication strategies that's provided or initiated by the organizations. And for those type of studies, often they're done with the traditional methods, such as survey and experiments. And oftentimes, I will find myself, tapping to cross-disciplinary theories, especially social psychology, try to understand what's the psychological mechanism behind this pattern, why or why not stakeholders would interact. And long story short, most of the time it's either associated with motivation, guided by the self-determination theories, or social identity, determining whether someone wants to be associated or disassociated with organizations, or it can also be guided by the attribution theories regarding how stakeholders would attribute the communication initiatives, consider that as skeptical or not. So, of course, like you guys may be wondering, so you have been talking about stakeholder engagement, then there's maybe assumption that you can assume stakeholder engagement is important, right? So it could be assumption. If it's not empirical tested, then it's an anecdote. So we don't know if stakeholder engagement is important or not. So how is that a fact? So what's the outcomes of stakeholder engagement, right? So that's a great question again. Then what I did was we actually looked into, so we tried to test out like to which degree stakeholder engagement is important by looking at from the social media data, so stakeholder engagement with different types of organizations on social media, by mining the real behavior data and pair that with return on expectation data and return on investment data to trying to map it out. So what type of engagement actually would exert positive changes or positive predictions to return on expectations and return on investment. So for return on expectations, we have used the secondary data collected by the Reputation Institute. I don't know if you guys heard about that institute. So they have been doing this annual survey with general American publics to understand how do they think about the major corporations in the United States. So there was a survey, and at the day they used the data to create composite scores and to rank all the organizations that's being ranked in this type of survey. So we mined 5-year longitudinal social media data and paired engagement with the reputations. And very interestingly, not all kinds of engagement or social media engagement is considered as significantly impacting the reputation. So only profound engagement, such as commenting, and also most importantly, comments with strong valence while exerting positive or negative impact on reputations. So that's on return on expectation. And for return on investment, so similarly, we mined S&P, you guys know Standard & Poor's, right? If you guys are interested in stock market, you better know that. So S&P 500 companies, again, we mined longitudinal data from those S&P 500 companies' social media interactions with stakeholders, and then we paired those data with Standard & Poor's revenue and stock performances. So we used the panel data analysis with lag data, panel longitudinal predictions, and we find that out. You know, if you pay attention to your stakeholder engagement online, you will know how much money you're gonna make next year. If you're, you know, as a communication manager or business manager in those companies. So that's also quite interesting. And also, more recently, I forgot to mention that. So all of those are different aspects that I tap into stakeholder engagement. And you probably noticed that a large chunk of my studies happen on social media. So I do use both computational methods and also traditional methods, because you know, if we're studying people's behaviors, engagement patterns on social media, the most unobtrusive way to measure engagement is through data mining. So, and also I have done computer-assisted automatic content analysis and also network analysis to map out the relations among different stakeholder groups as well. So more recently, this thing doesn't work. With a group of researchers, we have tapped into a new realm or new territory of stakeholder engagement, which is the startup communication part of. We're looking at how startup companies using the power of strategic communication to engage with different types of stakeholders and what's the outcome coming out from that. So as some of you probably know that, I was born and raised in Hangzhou. And as a very proud Hangzhouer, I'm very, very fascinated about the startup scene developing in Hangzhou because of the establishment of Alibaba Group. So because of Alibaba, Hangzhou has become a very technology savvy and startup booming city. So, and that has benefited a lot of changes happening in people's daily lives. So for example, you know, Chinese people like to fight for restaurant bills, right? Like nowadays, I'm considered as an expat. Every time I went back, I would never want the bill. Because everyone is tapping their phones to pay through QR codes while I will pull out a credit card, which make me a loser, right? Never win. And also, like, my mom goes to wet markets, like, she would just tap, tap, and then just grab whatever she wants, pay through the phone. So all of that is largely benefit from the startup scene happening in Hangzhou, and also some other tech hubs in China. So with two researchers from University of Miami, Rita Mann, University of Florida, Rita Mann, and also Fei Chen from University of San Francisco, we started a mega project. So wanted to look at, so who are the stakeholders of startup companies? So that's the question I ask you guys, right? And then what type of communication strategies they have been using to communicate with them. So, and also what are the outcomes coming out from them. We started from like meta literature review to exploratory analysis through conducting interviews with CEOs of those startup companies and also communication managers. And then moved on to content analysis of analyzing online communication patterns and to survey research by asking feedbacks from different types of stakeholder groups, both internally as employees, externally as customers, and also social media users. So I have published a couple of papers coming from this, and also a book. So we consider this book as one of the first strategic communication book looking into the startup communication sector, specifically in the context of China. Hashtag not ads, non-ads. But it's available on Amazon. So up to this stage, okay, every time I publish something that's related with stakeholder engagement, I claim that I'm researching stakeholder engagement from a de-organization-centric approach, all right? So, and I claim this is because I do not just study the communication strategies organizations use. I try to validate that and try to evaluate those strategies from the data I collected from stakeholders. So this type of evaluation assessment is data infused, and also it's deeply rooted in the stakeholders' perspectives, right? So that sounds all right, I guess. But then I was called out by a journal editor, not a reviewer, editor. So she was, it's a she, Armima probably knows who this person is. So she was saying, I don't think your claim is valid. So this is still a very much organization-centric approach of studying stakeholder engagement. And here's the reason why. So it turns out for engagement, in general, it's a contested construct, right? So we could look at engagement or stakeholder engagement from an instrumental approach. So by definition, the instrumental approach is looking at engagement as individual affective, cognitive, and behavioral responses to organizations' communication, right? So it centers on the direct relational, reputational, and also financial outcomes associated with an organization. Does that sound familiar to you guys? That's exactly what I've been doing, right? So it's the instrumental approach of stakeholder engagement. Well, on the other side of the spectrum, there's a different approach to study stakeholder engagement, which is the interprivist approach. So everyone doesn't buy that. So the interprivist approach is when we engage, we situate organizations in an ecological framework where they co-construct the meanings with their stakeholders, and then they use those engagement activities and communication power to address the most pressing issues in a society. So that is I think that's why she called me out saying, I don't think your stakeholder engagement approach is a de-organization-centric approach. It's still very company benefited, like centric. But then I looked into my research program again. I noticed that, hey, actually I do have studies tapping through the instrumental approach. So for example, cost-related marketing, right? So we're looking at how companies, when they're selling products, which strategies they would use would include or motivate customers to buy more products. So it's related with cost-related marketing. And also I have done a social media based study to look at how Fortune 500 companies through the function of mentioning. So by including different types of entities on social media to look at the networks that they build through mentioning function regarding climate change. So we use Ergo model and use the legitimacy theory to predict in which situations which company would be situated at the central or star position in a given network, etc. So those are actually interprivist approach. But because I was actually inspired by the comment, so I wanted to look more into that instead of just stopping there. So before I started doing any new, initiating any new projects, I wanted to know what's been studied, what's been missing. in related studies. So I actually, together with two other scholars from Minnesota, Hidro Lim and Wei Chow from University of Miami, we conducted a annotated bibliography network analysis to look at all the published studies, peer-reviewed studies in corporate social responsibility, so how they have been building, from a networked approach, have been building the literature of corporate social responsibility and what has been missing in terms of the theoretical approaches, the general themes that have been studied. And we found out that actually it's totally right. So although corporate social responsibility, when you think about it, it's the closest for corporate communication towards the interpretivist approach, right? But most of the times when researchers tap into corporate social responsibilities, the outcome often is, do our stakeholders trust us? Do we gain more reputation? Do we sell more products? So that's still, again, a very company-oriented approach. So that, again, motivated me to do something more to look at stakeholder engagement from a different perspective. And also, I always claim my research is phenomenon-based. So yes, my research is deep-rooted in the theory and the literature, but also I never wanted my research to be existing in a vacuum. So I'm always very observant about what's going on in the society, and I wanted to use the power of research to explain some of the trending patterns that's going on. So at the same time, when I was tapping into how we can, reconceptualize stakeholder engagement from the interpretivist approach, something happened. This is one of them, but the overall phenomenon is called CEO activism, right? So as you guys probably know that in recent years, the United States has undergone through very rapid social changes. So we have seen more and more CEOs or business leaders, they stand out and intentionally address on some very controversial social, political, environmental issues as individual behaviors, right? And then that actually causes some very long-lasting rippling effects, not only changing the public opinions, but also change the public policy making procedure. So this is one of the examples that happened most recently during early this year. So Eric Yuan and Debbie Su. So Eric Yuan is the CEO of Zoom. You guys probably all know that. And Debbie Su is the CEO of OpenTable. So including them, another 1,000-something CEOs get together to make a donation of $10 million to tackle the anti-Asian racism, violence-related things. And then prior to that was another very well-known incident, which was the Muslim travel ban that happened a couple of years ago, right? And at that time, about almost 100 US CEOs also get together. They actually sign a letter and then send this letter to judges, to the federal judges, and ask them to overturn the executive decisions of travel bans. So all of the incidents are considered as CEO activism. So, and then to be honest, when you look into the literature of strategic communication or public communication, CSR, and also leadership communication are the most burgeoning fields that's happening, right? But very interesting, they rarely cross the roads. But I do think leadership advocacy can actually merge in those two fields together, and maybe borrowing theories and literature from each other. So what I intended to do, so that's something encouraged me to look into, both from the theory perspective and also from the phenomenon perspective, to think about, okay, if CEOs or leaderships are doing things like that, then how would this affect employees, which is considered as the most prominent and important internal stakeholders, their reaction to the CEO advocacy, and most importantly, how this type of CEO or more primarily considered as some sort of internal leadership communication can mobilize internal stakeholders, but exerting long-term external impacts to the society. Again, the interpretivist approach of stakeholder engagement. So with Dr. Chen Hong from Cal State San Francisco, we started this research which is called Engage Employees in CEO Activism, the role of transparent leadership communication in making a social impact. And I have already talked about some of the backgrounds here. So I'm going to tap directly into the purpose of this research. So we wanted to know how CEO's leadership communication influences employees' engagement in activism programs. And then if so, what's the reason? So what motivated them? More specifically, what are the psychological reasonings behind it that the employees wanted to become part of this engagement force in terms of social activism? And also we wanted to take from the interpretive approach, meaning when we measure engagement, we specifically looked into the likability. Employees will share the information regarding the issues that the CEO advocated for. That's one variable that we measured. And also another thing is how likely, so that was the communicative variable. And then another variable is physically, how likely employees would participate in rallies, in protests, in making donations, and then in running fundraising, etc., to be part of this activism engagement. And then also, of course, some of the basic definition of CEO activism. So as I mentioned, we actually adopted this definition from Chatterjee and Total. If you guys follow Harvard Business Review, you probably have seen their names very often. So CEO activism is defined as CEOs intentionally take public stance on social, political, and environmental topics unrelated to their company's bottom lines without any obvious pretense of raising profits. So I acknowledge that it may sound somewhat similar to CSR, corporate social responsibility, similar to CSA, corporate advocacy, also similar to corporate political advocacy. So again, there are similarities and differences, but CEO activism, most importantly, is grounded in individual behaviors, and this individual happens to be the figurehead of a renowned company. So the impact or how stakeholders attribute that impact may or may not just to the individual behaviors, or sometimes also may be attributed to the organization's missions and reputations. But in this study, we do not intend to untangle them. And also, another thing is, so how is CSR different from advocacy in general? So when we talk about CSR, again, it's often outcomes we look at is it's company-centric, it's relational, reputational related. But for advocacy, we're looking at more societal-centric outcomes. And also for the issues that are often involved in advocacy, it's more controversial compared to CSR. It's more safe to do, right? So what we did, there are some other key variables and also paths, so we wanted to test it out. So as I mentioned about this employee activism engagement, we wanted to measure that through two perspectives. One is the communicative perspective and one is the behavioral perspective. And then we looked into a theory which is called social self-determination theory. So it basically lays out for individuals, we have basic psychological needs. So there are three dimensions. The needs for autonomy. So we wanted to obtain a sense of ownership of what we do. And the decision, we wanted to have a sense of ownership of the decision-making process. And need for competence, which is related to our feelings of being capable of developing new skills and accomplishing activities and goals. And also a third need is a need for relatedness, which is our need for connection, the feeling being cared or caring the community or the entity we are associated with. And in the past studies, we found out that at least in leadership communication in general, when employees their basic psychological needs are fulfilled, they're more willing to be engaged into some sort of company-related activities. For example, work better in their job performances or be more loyal to the company. We reason that, it may also be the case in the case of CEO activism. So that's our first hypothesis. And then secondly, we wanted to know, so what type of leadership communication behavior would trigger or would fulfill the basic psychological needs of employees. And then we found out that there's a very traditional leadership theory centers on transparent communication, transparent leadership communication, and that actually fits very well with the interpretivist approach of engagement. So the reason is, if you look at the definitions and you think about interpretivist engagement, it's all about co-creation, open to change, and also involvement. So hearing feedbacks and engaging stakeholders. So we propose that transparent leadership would fulfill the basic psychological needs of employees in terms of need for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And also there will be a direct link from transparent leadership communication to the two types of employee engagement in leadership advocacy. And essentially we wanted to see if this three psychological needs can be positive mediators, explain the psychological reasoning, the impact exerted from CEO transparent leadership to the employee activism engagement. So what we did was, this is the psychological model, more simpler to look at. But in order to test the hypothesis I just mentioned and also the psychological model, so we did an online survey with panel data provided by Dynata, which is a professional survey company. So we actually, when we designed the survey, we also had multiple screening questions and thought listing questions in order to prompt our participants to be more involved in our research settings, and then to help them to recall what they have went through if there's any CEO engagement happening or advocacy happening in their companies. So we provided them the definition of CEO advocacy and asked them if anything similar has happened. If so, please write a nice story about it, and also please tell us what's your CEO stance on this issue, and also what's your stance on this issue. So that's what we did. And after that screening process and the thought listing process, we gave them a bunch of different scales and measurement that measure the key variables that I just mentioned previously. So we use SEM, two-step SEM, so the model. I know this is a part you guys probably don't want to hear, but the story short, it's model data fit was pretty good. And we tested a couple of competing models, and we ended up with the final model looks like this. And then I didn't show you the controlling variables we entered into the model. So we actually controlled two variables, which one is issue involvement. So for example, as a nation, of course, I will be more prompted to the anti-Asian news related, right? And also for stance consistency, we control that, which is whether my stance is consistent with my CEO stance. That may also affect whether I want to engage or not engage with CEO advocacy. But again, those are important, but not the focal point of our research, so we control them statistically. So what we found is transparent leadership definitely, and its positive and considered effects is largely impact on fulfilling the individual psychological needs for employees. It's the direct path. And among those individual needs, not all of them, but relatedness, so the sense of connection, the sense of needing for the community actually exerted significant positive impact on both outcome variables, manifesting stakeholder engagement, and that is also was tested to be a significant mediator between transparent leadership on the two outcomes. But for autonomy and competence, so autonomy was only significant positively related to information sharing, so that made it a significant mediator between transparent leadership and information sharing. And for competence, it was only significant positively related to advocacy. So the physical engagement, physical participation was, again, protesting, rallying, making donations, and which made it a significant mediator between transparent communication and activism participation. So, well, long story short, we share similarities with previous findings, previous literatures, but of course there are some discrepancies. And we consider those discrepancies actually are an important contribution to literature. So first of all, different from previous literature, we argue that the contradiction may be attributed to the nature of CEO advocacy, which is not directly related to the bottom line of corporations. And employee activism engagement is also much different from employee performance, employee work loyalty, employee relationship with the company, which were all measured from the instrumental approach of engagement. So when employees, when they are engaged in some pro-social engagement or activism engagement, they are more in relation to the citizen duties and obligations. So therefore, when they are reacting to CEO advocacy messages, they're more likely to act as individual citizens and pay more attention to their own psychological needs as individual citizens. So that's why some of the findings are different from the previous findings. And also we noticed that for autonomy and competence, the reaction, the impacts on the two outcomes were also inconsistent, and we speculated that the consistency is because the outcomes have some, there are some congruencies between the outcomes and psychological needs. So for autonomy, it reflects individuals' desire to believe that they're the drive initiators of some sort of behaviors. So it is more resonated with sharing information and for self-expression. But for competence, when people have this feeling, have this need to feel psychologically competitive, they may probably would want to have a desire to master over the situation, an inherent desire to feel effective in interacting with the surroundings. So the physical engagement was going to, voting and rally and protest may provide them more sense of competence compared to autonomy. So and also we found out that transparent leadership communication actually did not have a direct impact on outcomes we were interested in. So this is also interesting, but it underscores that, just by communicating, so words doesn't, communicate louder than behaviors. So if we wanted to actually motivate employees to become part of, the forces for social change, we need to think about how our words can better fit and fulfill their psychological needs. So that's the most important lesson we learned from this research. All right. So and then, when does this end? 5 minutes. Okay. I will quickly go through another study, and then maybe that's it. But this study, it's actually quite interesting. So by the time when we wrapped up the study I just introduced to you, that was when Atlanta shooting happened. Right. So I was very, very emotionally charged when I, read all those social media posts about what happened, to those victims of Atlanta shooting, and also learn about their personal stories. So all I did was crying, feeling extremely sad and angry, and I couldn't do anything else. At one point, I had to tell myself, to stay away from social media to take care of my mental health. So that's one thing. And then there was a very, very nice letter came in from our dean. So so the letter is addressing, first of all, it's addressing the violence and issues related to the specific Atlantic shooting, and more importantly, it talks about all the initiatives we have been doing, contributing to the DEI, and what are the future plans we have in place. And also, what are the resources if we need help, can tap into to ask for more resources, and what are the things that we can tap upon. And also, at the last of this letter, I think it's still somewhere available on our website. So at the bottom of the letter, it's the emails where you can share your comments and your feedback if there's anything you would like to share with the college and also with the dean. So when I saw this letter, again, I was feeling very, very emotional, most on the negative side about what I've seen. And when I saw this letter, I've had these feelings. So warmth, uplifting, and going in my chest. And this is something I had rarely felt personally. So I have been wondering, so what is that feeling, right? Maybe you guys can try to think about if there's any situation that happens, incidents happen to you, you had this similar feelings. So what I did immediately was write back and asking if there's anything I could do as a researcher to use the power of research to address those issues. And of course, there was like more email exchanges and etc. And also, of course, I shared this letter. I very, very rarely share any political or activism related stuff on my social media, but that was one of those incidences as I did share something about my personal stance. So that actually is also an incident happened to me as leadership advocacy. All right? And when I looked into more literature, so I wanted to know if this personal experience actually is something transferable to a larger community or to employee in general. And I looked into literature, I noticed that this emotion actually is called elevation. So elevation is a very neat emotion. It's a positive emotion, but it's also a moral emotion. So it's positive moral emotion. And more importantly, how is it different from some other different types of positive emotions? Is the trigger of this emotion is the witness of some moral and virtuous behavior in a communication. And this type of behavior communication is not directly directed to the message receivers. And in return, the message receivers would produce some upwarding and upstreaming behavior, trying to be a better person, trying to behave more pro-socially to helping others in a community. So, and also at the same time, it will trigger this person to have a higher sense of belonging in a given community. So remember, that was my first year at BU, and I came during the pandemic, and that was also the first time I ever felt actually, I have a sense of belonging with BU because of this letter. So this is quite a very special moment for me, and I wanted to test it out. So we followed up with another survey where we wanted to look at the emotional employee moral elevation. How would this serve as a psychological effective mediator between employee authentic leadership? So we proposed that authentic leadership as a moral exemplar of communicating in a CU activism case will serve as an elicitor for employee moral emotion, and then employee moral emotion will enhance the identification between an individual employee and a company he or she works with, and also would again prompt and motivate them to physically activate in all kinds of pro-social activities. So, and also lastly, we want to test out the mediation effect and also a chain mediation effect from all the way from leadership to elevation to identification to engagement. And we got all of them checked. So that my feeling was true, and I was empirically supported. And this is the implication coming out from it. So that's all I want to talk about for my research. I don't know if we still have time for Q&A, but I will welcome any comments.
Chris, you have about 10 minutes for questions.
Oh, okay, cool. I thought I ran out of time.
No, you're good.
Questions? Yes?
I guess one of my questions was, like, while you were doing all this research, what did you find most fascinating about analyzing the pro-social effects?
Most fascinating. So I think the most fascinating part is how we as individuals can feel transcended through internal communication, and then how we want it to actually be the better self and help others. I think that's something I find it very interesting. And also, you will be surprised. Many times, like as a researcher, especially doing this type of pro-social research, if you're familiar with measurement, we know there are a lot of reasons coming from social desirability bias, right? So because you ask them, hey, do you want to be a good citizen? And people say, yeah, of course I want. But from our study, actually, the social desirability bias didn't really have a huge impact. So people do genuinely wanted to, engage with organizations. They are authentic and they're transparent, and they wanted to, contribute to the social goods in general. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes.
I'm just wondering, what made you first realize that you wanted to study stakeholder engagement? Was there a specific moment where a light bulb went off, or is there something that has always interested you?
Oh, that's a very good question. So, I think that's when I was RA, like research assistant for my advisor back in PhD years. So they were looking at, the financial, like stakeholder, social media patterns, how would that impact on return on expectation and investment. And that's where I started to be interested in stakeholder engagement. And also methodologically, we were all doing manual coding and manual data collection. I was like, there's got to be a better way that we could do this more efficiently. And that's how I started to get into the computational sides of collecting data, mining data, and analyzing data without doing everything manually. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Anything else? Yeah, Michelle, please.
Thank you. Very nice job. And it's interesting that your second example had to do with your experiences here at BU and the way the leadership was reacting to these national traumas
Right.
that we've been experiencing. And I have communicated to my friends and colleagues how impressed I've been with some of the leadership communication coming out of our university in comparison to other places I've been. But then I'm also thinking about, what else has been happening in the news recently, like other large companies, like what's happening with Facebook and all of the,
They're changing their
leadership
name.
vacuum. One could argue, I've heard now that they're actually considering rebranding, changing their name. So I'm wondering if you could speculate on
Which name they're going to change to, or?
but just what the impact of the lack of leadership, or the lack of leadership and, their employees.
Yeah, I think,
Yeah.
to be honest, I think Facebook is a very special case.
Yeah.
So, I hope this is not going to send me down, but I'm actually a big fan of Mark Zuckerberg and also his wife. So besides Facebook, they also have a Zuckerberg initiative, and his wife is also a pediatrician. So they have done a lot of philanthropy work. So I definitely see the value of them as being the two of the most influential couples in this world, and how they have contributed personally to the benefit, to the betterment of the world. And I can't think about any examples at this point, but there are multiple times I actually got moved by the statements they made and the kind gestures they made through the years about how they talked about activism and helping with the underserved communities. But then why I said Facebook is a very tricky example, because they're not only just a company, they're deeply rooted in our life, and then it's also, more importantly, it's a communication/news/tag, so it tapped into capitalism, it tapped into fake news, everything, so it makes everything super complicated.
Yeah.
Just in the case of Facebook.
Yeah, we saw just a few weeks ago when there was that outage, when you couldn't access
Right,
Facebook.
right.
Or WhatsApp. So they were using, some of our international students
Right.
couldn't communicate with their families
Right.
back home.
Yeah, you wrote a letter about
Yeah.
that, right? Yeah. Yeah, so, there's multi-factors building into that in this case for Facebook. Yeah, but of course, going back to the literature of corporate responsibility, so part of it is, company performance. So that's also related to how people would perceive this company, right? Yeah. So the outage or the fake news coming out, and also the data privacy issues also built into that. Yeah. Yes?
I think CEO activism is something I'm really interested in, because right now, not only you guys, there are a lot of big companies, startups in China, such as ByteDance, Tencent, DJI maybe, a lot of those companies, Alibaba also.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. So I was wondering what type of issues their CEOs would advocate
Yes,
for.
that's what I'm thinking, because I never really see some posts, like they posted on their social media
Right.
about social issues.
Mhm.
They really speak out about something. So I don't really see that. So I just want to ask, do you see this as a message in the US and China CEOs are taking?
Empirically, I haven't tested out, but based on my observation, I saw Chris was laughing about it. He's a specialty on East Chinese studies, right? Political environment. That's my best guess, would be at this point.
I think that's all we have time for, just
Oh.
because there's a class.
Oh,
Yes.
sorry. But yeah, feel free to talk, to like chat with me.